We're going to talk about the importance of leading through uncertainty and leading through these times of dramatic change. And one of the things that I've learned is that midway through any meaningful change feels an awful lot like failure. So as leaders, we have to have a vision, that is very vivid for our people, and we put words together to portray that vision because people are drawn to the vision. The leader with our words can release the energy and passion within our organization. And in the spirit of words matter, one of the things that we often had fun with at Schneider is that I often talked about the fact that hope is not a strategy. It's neither, it isn't a tactic, it isn't a method, it isn't a plan. And oftentimes as leaders, that word hope, we hope for a certain outcome comes in. Well, if you think about that, if we're relying on hope, we're probably in trouble. And I was told many years ago when I was a student at the Army War College by a career State Department employee that words matter. So challenge yourself when you're speaking to people to, one, not use the word hope. In fact, we had what we called a hope jar at Schneider, where if somebody in a meeting would use the word hope, we would have them throw in a quarter or a dollar that we would spend on a team building exercise later. But it sounds a little bit silly, but choose words carefully when we're communicating change to the organization, because people will really hang on every word. And so I would encourage you to change the word hope with the word expect. This is the outcome we expect, and to be able to communicate that with passion and enthusiasm. And moving right along, I mentioned we're going to talk about culture. And the definition that I use for culture is a set of shared beliefs, attitudes, and values, or goals and practices that characterize a company. And I think the key words in that definition are beliefs and values, and we'll talk about that. But as I mentioned before, setting the company culture by creating shared beliefs is a senior leader accountability. But whether we're the CEO or whether we're a manager in the organization or whether we're a driver, we all have the ability and the obligation to influence change, to influence the culture within our organization. And we'll talk in a minute about values and priorities and how they differ. Priorities change. Priorities typically are situational, whereas values tend to be enduring. So many of you have an espoused value of safety, for example, first and always, or safety 24/7, safety 365. Our employees or our drivers are our most precious resource. Those are espoused values. We have to make sure, and they're critically important because they provide guidance to our people about how to reconcile the tension between the competing demands that they face every day. But our challenge is to make sure that there's congruence between our espoused values, which is what we say, and our enacted values, which is what we do, because not only our drivers, but our frontline leaders will do an acid test of our core values to see whether or not what we say and what we do match. Critically important. Back to the theme of words matter. And switching gears just a little bit, I talked about the importance of our individual and collective beliefs. And my guess is that there's undoubtedly some safety managers who are on the call today. And most safety managers have been educated to manage behaviors. It's really a focus. If you think about safety, it's about the avoidance of negative outcomes. We tend to focus on the negative outcomes. And we recognize that we have to address behaviors. And while that's true, if you accept the premise that our behaviors are an outcome, they're an outcome of our beliefs, and if we want to address any issues that we have at the root level, we need to address it at the belief level. And it used to be that success and safety flowed to carriers who would react to an incident with some type of remediation such that there wouldn't be a recurrence of that type of an incident. Well, today we have the luxury of not only data, but we also have active safety technologies that really have changed how we define success. And success flows to those who can detect problematic behavior before a crash or incident occurs and take action so that it never occurs. and it's the early near-miss detection of behaviors is critical. So I don't want to suggest by behaviors not being at the root that we can ignore behavior-based safety management. But what I believe as leaders and our challenge is to address our organizational beliefs as really step one and transition from behavior-based safety management to belief-based safety leadership. We manage processes, we manage data, but ultimately we lead people, which will be the guarantor of our success or our failure. So let's switch gears and talk just a little bit about selling safety to executives. This slide, I got a call a few years back from a gentleman who asked if I would be willing to give the keynote address at TIDA's annual meeting. I didn't at the time, frankly, know what TIDA stood for, but it's the Trucking Industry Defense Association. And I agreed to do that, but I was asked to give an update on our industry, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I said, well, what part of our industry do you want me to update? Do you want me to tell you what the good guys are doing, or do you want me to tell you what the bad guys aren't doing? And so the thought began to emerge in my mind of what's the difference? Characteristically, what's the difference between kind of the carriers with a strong culture and those perhaps with a weak culture? So I'll let you kind of take a look at what I included as those characterizations. Zero fatalities is the goal for strong carriers or carriers with strong culture. Some view fatality, crashes, God forbid, in our industry as a cost of doing business. In good carriers, safety is a core value. In good carriers, they're emotionally connected empathically to the cost of failure in our industry, which is often serious injuries sustained and fatalities. That's the reality of 80,000-pound trucks and 3,000-pound cars. Generally, in my experience, the stronger carriers view safety through a moral lens and not through a financial lens, although I'll tell you in a minute, it doesn't really matter which lens you look at it through because it'll take you to the same place. And probably the biggest thing is strong carriers are proactive. For those who take comfort in the fact that because FMCSA hasn't mandated a particular technology or a particular program, that they're not obligated to do that. The one thing I learned, I did serve on the Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committee for FMCSA and have some dear friends in that organization, but I think they would agree with me when I say that innovators will lead regulators every time. So there's certainly no need to wait for regulators to mandate certain things, and we'll talk more in a minute about why that is. So I talked a little bit about viewing safety through a moral lens, and I think it's essential that we understand, as I mentioned before, that as transportation professionals, we have a moral obligation to the motoring public with whom we share our workplace to be as safe as we can be. And in many ways, that comes down moralistically to doing the right things. And only you can introspectively challenge yourselves and your company as to whether or not you're doing the right things. It's also important that we do the right things right, which are two very different things. But I think you'll agree, and we're certainly seeing it here in the past few weeks, that the essentiality of commercial transportation has never been more evident to the public than it is right now, in terms of the efforts that are going on to make sure that supplies get to where they're needed, even with this fear of pandemic in place. And we had a credo at Schneider that I loved for its simplicity, and it really spoke to our number one core value of safety first and always. And it was very simply this, is that nothing that we do, albeit important, the work that we do, but nothing we do is worth harming ourselves or others. And if we can cause our people to believe that, their behaviors will follow that belief. And when there is potential tension between the competing demands of safety and, say, productivity, which is a proxy for profitability, or safety and service in this service-sensitive economy that we're in right now, it provides guidance to people that we reconcile that tension in the name of safety, which is the right thing to do. So one of the things that I would suggest being important, and I probably will take a shot at some accountants here, and I will exaggerate to make the point, but I think that we have to modify the way we think about return on investment thresholds for investments. And that safety really has to take a category of its own. So you may have an arbitrary or maybe it's a thoughtful threshold of a 40% return on invested capital for any intervention that you may be contemplating. In my view, with safety being so critical, if we have reasonable confidence that we can cover the cost of capital that it takes to invest in the intervention, technology, the program, whatever it may be, you default to yes, because the downside is limited and the upside is significant. So I'm not suggesting that we get a free pass on the ROI calculations for safety, but when in doubt, and the reality these days is capital is nearly free. So when you think about the confidence that we have in our ability to cover the cost of capital, it perhaps changes the lens through which you look at a safety investment. And I won't spend a tremendous amount of time on this slide. I put this together a while back. And one of the things that I asked a critical question is, what percent of every risk and safety dollar that we spend is spent on what we would consider pure prevention versus settlements when we fail, so claim settlement. And I would guess that if I were to ask the carrier representatives on the call today, what percentage of your total risk spend, which would include insurance premiums as well, is on prevention versus claim settlement, you probably don't know, because it's very likely that you haven't asked and answered that question. So if you do ask that question, and there are some assumptions that you have to make in calculating what are our prevention dollars and what are claim settlement and insurance dollars, but it's certainly not that difficult to do, you may well be surprised at what you find. And generally speaking, this is a generalization that would be difficult for me to prove across the industry. But in the industry, generally speaking, about 15 to 20% is spent on pure prevention, and the balance is spent on settling claims and paying insurance. And I don't think any thinking leader would draw the line between prevention spend and claim settlement where it often is with carriers because of the moral obligation that we talked about. And when you think about the rapidly escalating costs in post-crash litigation with nuclear verdicts and with skyrocketing insurance premiums, I think you'll agree that we have to shift that line, if you will, more toward prevention so that we can spend less on claim settlement. And I don't believe for a second, there are some who say, well, meaningful tort reform worked in the area of medical malpractice, and we have to wait for meaningful tort reform in the trucking industry. And I would encourage you to not wait, because I don't believe for a second that meaningful tort reform is on the horizon. It may happen at some point, but it certainly hasn't happened yet, and it likely won't for quite some time. So I want to switch gears just a little bit for a few minutes and talk about selling safety to company leaders. We've talked about it. I want to spend a few minutes talking about other company leaders. I'm sure many of you have observed, as I did, that driver leaders and dispatchers tend to be task saturated. And so we have to convince them that whatever initiative we're contemplating will reduce and not worsen their already hectic work life. And that by focusing on prevention, we'll actually save drivers. So when we look through the lens of our driver capacity and the challenge of recruiting drivers in this environment, to the extent that we can decrease that churn due to safety issues because we identified those early, that it's a solid investment in our time. And focusing more time on leading or coaching is better than time spent investigating failure and putting drivers through either training or some type of progressive discipline. So when you're thinking about communicating with a task-saturated group, the last thing you want to do is to say, I'm going to add another rock to your rucksack for you to carry, but to say in time, the efficacy of this initiative that we're contemplating is actually going to reduce your workload, not worsen it. So we'll switch gears now to a critical element, and that's really selling safety to drivers. And I had a boss many years ago who had what he called the Great American Rule. It was this credo. And the essence of the Great American Rule was that when professionals disagree, and let's face it, we will from time to time, but generally speaking, when we disagree, it's because you know something I don't know, I know something you don't know, or something got lost or garbled in our communication. And at its essence, most of our disagreements are normally communications breakdowns and really not philosophical differences. And I can tell you, I had many, many conversations with drivers. And once we leveled the playing field with what they knew that I didn't know and what I knew that they didn't know, we were in agreement almost all the time. And I would end the conversation with a driver about, if you were me, in light of what we just talked about, what would you do? And generally speaking, the drivers responded with, I would do exactly what you did. So selling safety to drivers, this is motherhood and apple pie to most of you, but we do have to unclog the lines of communications. Drivers sit behind the wheel for hours every day. Small issues can fester into bigger issues, and they will fill in the blanks of what you have not communicated to them with what they think, which is frequently wrong. The other thing as it relates to drivers is I found out that it's important to engage the drivers in not just problem identification and re-communicating in subtly different ways the nature of the problem, but to quickly transition from storytelling and war storytelling to solutions and putting the pen in their hand about, okay, how should we think about a solution to whatever problem that we're collectively facing? Critically important in our communication, and I think you already know this, is not just communicating the what, but also communicating the why to what we are doing. And ask, as I mentioned before, if you were me, what would you do in light of what we've talked about? And oftentimes I caution against using emotion. I've often said that emotion can at times cloud your judgment. I think safety is the exception to that rule, in that we want to play the emotion card. And generally speaking, the professional drivers with whom I've interacted with over the years are very committed to the safety obligation that they have as a transportation professional in playing the emotion card and exposing them to a family that has been devastated by the loss of a loved one or someone who has suffered a serious injury. You can quickly get them to drop their guard and to really connect with the message that you're trying to communicate with them.